Breaking news. Could Trump be removed from office? What is happening right now in Washington could change the course of world politics, and many people still haven't realized the magnitude of it. This is not just another fight between parties. It is a dispute involving presidential power, the global economy, and the future of American democracy itself. If this process moves forward, international agreements could be reviewed, the dollar could react, and decisions that affect the entire world could take a different path. But there is a problem. On social media, this issue is being treated like a football rivalry. On one side, people claim everything is already decided. On the other, voices say it is nothing more than persecution. And in the middle of all this, ordinary citizens are left without understanding what is fact, what is opinion, and what is just political noise. In this video, I will explain, in a clear and direct way, what is really at stake, how a process like this works in the United States, and what the most likely scenarios are from now on, without exaggeration, without empty promises, and without turning news into a spectacle. Stay with me until the end, because the last part is the most important. I will show how this clash can affect your wallet, prices, and US relations with the world. I'll make you a quick and sincere invitation. If you value responsible analysis, leave a like so this content can reach more people, and subscribe to the channel, so you don't have to rely on questionable headlines. Real information is the best protection in times of uncertainty. Now, let's get to what matters. The debate over a possible process against Donald Trump has returned to the center of American politics and needs to be understood calmly. In the United States, impeachment is not a headline, it is a constitutional mechanism with strict steps. It begins in the House of Representatives, goes through a formal investigation, and only ends in removal if 2/3 of the Senate vote in favor. Without this qualified majority, the president remains in office. The accusations circulating speak of abuse of power, a concept that in American law involves the use of presidential authority for personal benefit or illegal interference in institutions. Political disagreement is not enough. It is necessary to demonstrate that official decisions were made to protect the leader's own personal, electoral, or economic interests. Trump has faced similar processes in the past and survived them politically. This shows that, in practice, the decisive factor is not only legal, but also partisan. The Republican Party controls a significant part of Congress and tends to protect its main electoral figure. Without an internal rupture, any attempt at removal faces an almost insurmountable barrier. The current context, however, is different from previous years. There is a more tense relationship between the president and traditional sectors of the American right. Part of the business community and former allies fear that the permanent confrontational style will harm the economy and the country's international image. This internal division is the new element that must be observed. From an institutional point of view, the process follows 3 fronts. The first is legal, with analysis of documents, testimonies, and administrative decisions made by Trump. The second is political, with negotiations among party leaders to measure the electoral cost of supporting or abandoning the president. The third is public because voters' opinion directly influences lawmakers' votes. The international impact is also immediate. Any instability in Washington affects financial markets, trade agreements, and global security decisions. Allied countries watch to see whether the United States will remain predictable or enter a prolonged cycle of political crises. Strategic adversaries such as Russia and China assess whether the moment opens space to expand their influence. It is important to separate 2 levels. On the level of facts, there are ongoing investigations and questions about specific acts of the Trump administration. On the level of interpretations, there is a war of narratives. For his supporters, this is an attempt to nullify the will of the voters. For his critics, it is the necessary application of the law to a president who crossed limits. The American system was designed to be slow precisely to avoid hasty decisions. Each step requires voting, technical opinions, and the right to defense. Therefore, talking about immediate removal does not correspond to the reality of the process. What exists is a long dispute that may end either in acquittal or in political condemnation. Another central point is the balance of forces within the Senate. Even if the House approves an impeachment request, the final judgment depends on senators who think first about their own re-election. If the Republican electorate continues largely on Trump's side, few lawmakers will risk breaking with him. The economy also weighs heavily. Presidents in periods of growth usually withstand political crises better. If indicators such as employment and inflation deteriorate, the support base tends to shrink. The opposite is also true. Economic improvement weakens any removal movement. There is also the electoral factor. Trump remains the main leader of his party and influences candidate choices across the country. Many representatives and senators owe their mandates to his support. This dependence creates a political shield that is hard to break. On the Democrats' side, the strategy is to prove that the debate is not ideological, but institutional. They try to present the process as a defense of the rules of the game, not as revenge. The success of this narrative depends on solid evidence and the ability to dialogue with independent voters. For ordinary citizens, the practical effect appears in daily life. Political uncertainty in the United States usually strengthens the dollar, pressures international prices, and postpones investments. Companies wait for clear signals before closing long-term contracts. In the short term, three paths are possible. The first is that the process does not advance due to lack of consensus and becomes only political wear. The second is that the House approves impeachment, but the Senate rejects it, repeating what has happened before. The third, less likely at the moment, is an internal rupture within the Republican Party that changes the balance. In the medium term, the episode may redefine the balance between executive and legislative powers in the United States. If Congress manages to impose limits, it sets a precedent for future presidents. If it fails, it reinforces the idea that party loyalty weighs more than institutional control. What we see so far is a country almost evenly divided. Half sees Trump as a victim of persecution. The other half considers him responsible for straining democracy. Between these two poles is a decisive portion of voters still evaluating the information. Therefore, any definitive conclusion is premature. The process is in motion and depends on variables that change every week: new documents, court decisions, external crises, and economic performance. The role of journalism is to follow these stages clearly, without turning investigation into a premature sentence. Fact is different from opinion, and, up to this moment, what exists is an institutional confrontation underway, not a defined outcome. From now on, it is necessary to watch closely the next testimonies, the market's reaction, and especially the signals that will come from within the Republican Party. Behind the scenes in Washington indicate that the real dispute does not happen only at the microphones of Congress, but in closed rooms where party leaders calculate electoral scenarios. Every representative and every senator knows that a vote for or against Trump can define their career. In the United States, re-election depends much more on the local base than on national guidelines, and this base remains strongly mobilized. Meanwhile, the committees responsible for the investigations work with an enormous volume of documents, executive orders, call records, emails, and testimonies from former aides form a complex puzzle. Unlike what it seems on social media, none of these materials has automatic effect. Everything needs to be analyzed by technical teams and then turned into legal arguments understandable to Congress. A little discussed aspect is the role of the judiciary. Even if the legislature advances, decisions by federal judges can delay or even block parts of the process. Trump and his legal team have a history of appealing every step, using all available legal instruments. This makes the calendar unpredictable and pushes any outcome to a more distant horizon. Internationally, traditional U.S. allies adopt a wait-and-see stance. European governments, for example, avoid making long-term strategic commitments, while they do not know who will actually command the White House in the coming years. Asian countries follow with the same caution, fearing that American domestic instability will affect military and trade agreements. In Latin America, The effect is even more sensitive. Economies dependent on the US market quickly feel any sign of political turbulence. Investors postpone projects, currencies fluctuate, and local governments need to redesign strategies. That is why the debate in Washington crosses borders and becomes a domestic issue in several capitals. Inside the United States, polarization creates a difficult environment for dialogue. Television channels, radio, and digital platforms speak to different audiences, with almost opposite versions of the same facts. This phenomenon complicates the work of moderate lawmakers who try to build bridges but end up pressured by the extremes. Investigate. Another decisive element is campaign financing. Major donors closely watch the investigations to decide where to place resources. If the climate becomes very unfavorable to Trump, part of this money may migrate to alternative names within the Republican Party itself. This silent movement often weighs more than fiery speeches. From the institutional side, experts recall that impeachment was designed as a last resort, not as a routine tool of political dispute. When used frequently, the mechanism loses strength and becomes just another chapter of the electoral fight. This concern appears among both Democrats and traditional Republicans. There is also the debate about precedents. If a president is removed for decisions considered controversial, future governments may face the same fate whenever there is a change of majority in Congress. On the other hand, if serious accusations have no consequence at all, the signal sent is one of impunity at the top of power. On the streets, opinion polls show an electorate divided and tired. Many Americans say they are more worried about inflation, health, and jobs than about legal battles. This gap between the population's priorities and Washington's agenda may influence the pace of the process. Independent media try to navigate between two risks: minimizing relevant facts or turning every step into a spectacle. Responsible coverage requires explaining procedures, deadlines, and legal limits, something less sensational, but essential for the public to understand what is truly at stake. Trump, in turn, maintains a strategy of direct confrontation. He accuses opponents of persecution, mobilizes supporters, and uses the investigation as political fuel. This posture makes any negotiated solution difficult and keeps the country in a permanent campaign. Atmosphere. Veteran observers recall that American history has gone through similar moments and the system eventually found institutional solutions, but they also warn that the current level of polarization is higher than in previous crises, which increases uncertainty. In Congress, the coming weeks will be marked by public hearings. Key witnesses are expected to testify, and each deposition can change lawmakers' mood. A convincing account has the potential to shift votes. Contradictions, on the contrary, strengthen Trump's defense. It is essential to understand that the process judges not only one man, but the balance between powers in the United States. The way this crisis is resolved will serve as a reference for other democracies facing popular leaders and pressured institutions. For now, the scenario remains open. There is no single path nor guaranteed result. What exists is a dispute that mixes law, politics, economy, and communication, followed in real time by millions of people around the world. And it is exactly at this point that the story continues to be written. In the corridors of the Capitol, the atmosphere is one of constant calculation. Lawmakers talk to lawyers, consult local polls, and measure their base's reactions before any public positioning. Contrary to what many imagine, few want to take the role of protagonists. Most prefer to wait and see who will have real strength to conduct the process. The technical teams in Congress work to transform broad accusations into objective chapters. Each possible irregularity needs to be described with dates, documents, and witnesses. Without this foundation, the impeachment request becomes fragile and easily contested in courts and in public opinion. At the same time, the government tries to keep its agenda running. The White House announces economic measures, discusses foreign policy, and seeks to project administrative normality. The strategy is simple: to convey the idea that the country continues to move forward despite the political crisis, Constitutional law experts explain that the American system was designed to withstand conflicts of this kind. The separation of powers creates checks and balances precisely to avoid hasty decisions. That is why the process seems slow to those watching from abroad. But it follows the logic established in the Constitution. Another relevant factor is the role of governors. Many of them are regional leaders with great influence over representatives and senators. If these governors begin to distance themselves from Trump, the scenario in Congress could change rapidly. So far, most have maintained a cautious position. In the military field, the central concern is to preserve institutional stability. The U.S. Armed Forces traditionally adopt a posture of absolute neutrality in partisan disputes. Any sign of politicization within the barracks would be seen as a serious risk to the country's democracy. The economy remains a decisive thermometer. Investors follow each hearing as if it were a financial indicator. Stock markets react to rumors, and companies evaluate whether to expand or hold back hiring. This indirect effect pressures politicians to seek solutions that do not prolong uncertainty. In universities and research centers, the debate is deeper. Scholars discuss whether the current impeachment model still fits the reality of a hyper-polarized country connected by social media. Some advocate reforms that would make the process less dependent on partisan majorities. For ordinary voters, the feeling is one of repetition. Many remember previous crises and wonder whether the country has entered a permanent cycle of confrontations. This social fatigue may influence future elections, favoring candidates who promise reconciliation. Traditional media try to recover credibility by explaining details that rarely appear in short videos. How a committee works, what each vote means, what the real deadlines are. This educational effort is essential to prevent rumors from replacing verified information. Trump remains politically active, attending events and maintaining direct dialogue with his base. He is betting that popular support will be enough to constrain undecided lawmakers. This strategy has worked in the past and continues to be his main shield. However, a generation of leaders within the Republican Party is growing that is already thinking about the post-Trump era. They fear that the party could become trapped around a single name and lose the ability to speak to moderate voters. This internal tension may become visible as the process moves forward. Foreign observers recall that the United States has always presented itself as an example of democratic stability. That is why the world follows each step closely. The outcome will have symbolic impact far beyond American borders. On the legal level, lawyers debate whether certain conducts truly fit the constitutional definition of abuse of power. The interpretation is not simple and involves historical precedents, some more than a century old. This technical debate is often ignored in the political heat. Meanwhile, civil society organizations push for transparency. Pro-democracy groups demand access to documents and criticize attempts at secrecy. On the other side, conservative movements denounce what they call the political use of institutions. The truth is that the process has become a test for the entire American system. It reveals strengths and weaknesses of a democracy built over more than 200 years and now challenged by a digital environment that accelerates emotions and reduces patience. In the coming days, new chapters are expected with the release of preliminary reports. Every paragraph of these documents will be examined as part of a larger game. Nothing, however, points to a quick solution, and so the story continues to move forward, step by step, between courts, committees, and political disputes.